Every semester, students at SDU deliver excellent assignments on various topics. They demonstrate that they have the relevant skills needed to analyze questions of relevance to researchers and business practitioners. In 2021, students worked on an assignment that aimed to explain what motivates firms to trade with or invest in specific foreign markets. In the following, we will present findings from 5 student assignments at SDU using quantitative research methods. This assignment is provided by Adam, Anneke, Christian, Sharanjah, and Sofie. It's called Understanding the Causal Relationship Between Institutional Environments and FDI. This group demonstrates the relevance of regulatory institutions.
Hello and welcome. We are Group 11, and this is a PowerPoint presentation about understanding the causal relationship between institutional environments and FDI. We found that regulatory institutions have a positive impact on FDI. Furthermore, neither political institutions nor economic institutions have a significant impact on FDI. This research examines how foreign institutions are able to attract or discourage FDI into a country. To investigate the relationship between FDI and regulatory, political, and economic institutions, we've performed a factor analysis and regression analysis. We start out with our introduction, then followed by our sampling frame. Then we have measurements, hypothesis. Then we show our factor analysis and regression analysis, ending up with conclusion and limitation. The purpose of this analysis is to develop a research approach testing our hypothesis on the causal relationship between institutional environments and foreign market entry choices. We conduct our analysis with factor analysis and a regression model. We started out with 186 countries derived from different databases. We choose 19 indicators variables and divided them into 3 determinants: regulatory, political, and economic. Due to missing data, we ended up with 166 countries. Those 166 countries are divided on 6 continents, excluding Antarctica. The variables for regulatory are investment freedom, trade freedom, monetary freedom, business freedom, property rights, corruption, and judicial effectiveness. For political, they are political stability, strength of legal rights, government integrity, political rights, and civil liberties. For economic, they are GDP per capita, GDP growth rate, unemployment rate, inflation rate, fiscal health, government expenditure of GDP, and FDI inflow.
I will continue with our 3 hypotheses. Our first hypothesis is about the regulatory institutions. We assume that countries with many regulations will attract less inward FDI. According to Holmes, the less government intervention there is, the more likely FDI will increase. Thus, we expect a negative relationship between the regulatory determinants and FDI. Our second hypothesis is regarding the political institutions. We assume that countries with stability and political institutions will attract more inward FDI. According to Bailey, stable political institutions lead to economic growth and may attract FDI. So we expect a positive relationship between the political determinant and FDI. Our third hypothesis is regarding the economic institutions. We state that highly developed countries will attract more inward FDI. Through these economic institutions, according to Holmes, a country can encourage FDI. Thus, we expect a positive relationship between the economical determinant and FDI. Let's start with our factor analysis in order to relate the independent variables to each of the determinants. We followed 6 steps to do this factor analysis, and first we start by formulating the problem. So first of all, we made a set of data regarding all the institutional measurements. Second, the representative indicators were found by shortening the measurements through a data reduction. Third, we identified the 3 dimensions. And fourth, the 19 independent variables that we chose were then put into the 3 uncorrelated factors, which are the regulatory, the political, and the economic institutions.
So after formulating the problem, we then moved on to step 2 of the factor analysis. This is where we computed and tested the correlation matrix. And as you can see below, multiple models were tested. In the first model, we were able to come up with an acceptable data set for the factor analysis, which had a deserving result in the KMO test at 0.878. But despite this result, we still had 2 independent variables that fell below the desired MSA value of 0.5, and these were unemployment rate and GDP growth rate. So after computing and analyzing multiple models, we chose to reduce the number of independent variables to 11, which were best suited to continue the process. And unemployment rate was included in these 11 variables as it was needed to continue and make this model work. So as a result of these changes, you can see that we had a KMO score of 0.858. And from this, 3 factors were extracted under regulatory, political, and economic institutions. Here we can see that the KMO result of the second model, which was discussed in the previous slide, has a significance level of under 0.05. So we were able to reject the null hypothesis and conclude that there are some correlations in the data set. So to finish with the correlation matrix, we computed an anti-image matrix, and all measures are highlighted diagonally here, and they are above the acceptable level of 0.5, except for unemployment rate, which you can see highlighted in yellow. But as expressed, it was needed to continue with this model. So our next step involved extracting factors, and here a variance of 60% was the minimum requirement. And our 3 factors explain 72.27% of the variance, which is sufficient. Step 4 and 5 involved rotating and interpreting the factors, where we were able to form 3 factors, which were all derived from the high factor loading seen highlighted in the image, along with the variables which each factor consisted of under regulatory, political, and economic institutions. And finally, by using the Cronbach's alpha test, we were able to test the reliability of our scale. And here you can see that both the regulatory and political factors are above the desired level of 0.7, meaning that they are reliable factors. Economic institutions was below the desired level, but as a group, we decided to move forward with the process as this is the best model that we could find.
The next part of our study is the regression analysis. First, we formulate the research problem built on our hypothesis to test the regression analysis. Our dependent variable is FDI inflow in millions. We have 3 independent variables, which are high regulations, political stability, and economic development. First, we have a look at the model summary. We see that 10% of the variance in FDI inflows is explained by the predictors regulatory, political, and economic institutions. Having a look at the ANOVA, we see that the p-value is below 5%, which means that our model is significant and that there's evidence that at least one of our independent variables affect FDI inflows. Next, we look at the standardized coefficients because they take out the different measurement levels. We see that regulatory have a positive influence of FDI inflows. Looking at political and economic institutions, we see that the numbers are about 0, so they have almost no impact on FDI. But having a look at the significance levels, we also see that the regulatory institutions are significant, but political and economic are not. So we can conclude the stronger a country's regulatory institution is, the more FDI will flow into the country. Next up, we look at the variance inflation factor. They measure whether there is multicollinearity between the different variables in our data set, and all of the numbers are below 5, so there's no problem of multicollinearity. Having a look at the scatter plot, we see that there's a pattern. We don't want a pattern because we don't want to have constant variance of error terms. So we can conclude that our model might not be good enough. Having a look at the histogram, we want to see a normal distribution of error terms. The histogram doesn't look that bad, but still can be improved. If we look at the test of normality, we look at the Kolmogorov-Smirnov test because we have a sample size of over 50. We aim to not reject the null hypothesis, but in this case, we would accept the null hypothesis. So we have to improve our model to have better performance at the test of normality. So next step would be to remove the skewness of the data.
Moving on to step 5. In step 5, we remove the skewness by using the logarithm function to improve our model. Looking at the Kolmogorov-Smirnov test, our p-value is higher than 0.05, so we do not reject the null hypothesis. This means that errors are normally distributed. Looking at our scatter plot now, it shows a constant variance of the error terms because there is neither an increase nor a decrease in the error variance. This indicates that our variables are good enough and relevant determinants are not missing in our model now. Therefore, our model is acceptable. When we compare our initial regression model and the improved regression model after applying the logarithm function, it is evident that our new model has a higher explanatory power with a 25.9%. In step 6, we check the overall fit of the improved regression model. Since our p-value is lower than 0.05, we can reject the null hypothesis that all the regression coefficients are equal to 0. Our model is therefore significant. In step 7, we now check the effect of the independent variables separately in our improved model. Looking at the standardized coefficients, the improved model shows that the regulatory variable is the most important driver of FDI. The economic variable has a small impact on FDI, while the political variable does not influence FDI at all. So compared to the initial model, the only difference is that the economic variable has an impact on FDI in the improved model. Now to evaluating the p-values. The regulatory variable is significant because p-value is lower than 0.05. Therefore, there is evidence that the regulatory variable significantly relates to FDI. Both the political and the economic variable are not significant, and so they do not relate significantly to FDI. Then we have the VIF. Since the VIF in our model for all three coefficients is smaller than 5, there is no problem of collinearity, meaning the variables are not contributing redundant information to the model. Hypothesis 1 is partially confirmed because p-value is lower than 0.05, thus the regulatory determinant has a significant impact on FDI. Nevertheless, compared to what we expected in our hypothesis 1, the impact is positive and not negative. This means the greater the regulatory determinant, the more FDI. Hypothesis 2 and hypothesis 3 are not confirmed because both p-values are higher than 0.05, so neither the political nor the economic determinant have a significant impact on FDI. To sum everything up, 3 hypotheses were formulated to test the causal relationships between a country's institutional environment and FDI into the country. In our factor analysis, 3 dimensions, regulatory, political, and economic institutions, with 11 indicators were identified. The model explains 72% of the variance in the inward FDI. The determinants regulatory and political institution are reliable compared to the economic institution, which is not. In our regression analysis, our initial regression model showed that the data is not normally distributed since our p-value was lower than 0.05. The logarithm function was used to remove the skewness. The improved model showed a higher explanatory power and showed that no problems of multicollinearity. So to conclude, our regulatory institution has a positive impact on inward FDI and is significant, whereas political and economic institutions are not significant. Again, we have our conclusion. Hypothesis 1, we accept. Hypothesis 2, we reject. And then with the last hypothesis, we also reject. Moving on to further explanations. With our hypothesis 1, we expected a negative relationship between the regulatory institutions and FDI, because on the one hand, inefficiency can occur when governments deform private incentives through taxes and targeted regulations. Moreover, financial resources cannot be used efficiently by government policies. However, our research shows that there is a positive impact of regulatory institutions and FDI. This means, on the other hand, governments can promote economic growth by implementing policies which attracts FDI. With hypothesis 2 and hypothesis 3, our study shows that there is no significant relationship between the political and economic institutions and FDI. In our study, we were lacking on data. However, other studies state that there is a significant relationship. We suggest that future studies include other variables that support the determinants more effectively. In terms of the limitations of our study, there was a limitation on the countries we used. We only used 166 out of 186 countries. Our independent variables might not have explained each determinant efficiently either. Although the anti-image correlation value of the independent variable unemployment is under 0.5, it was considered in the analysis.
I hope you enjoyed watching. Feel free to get in touch in the case of any questions.